You know, some questions feel like they were designed to break our brains. They aren't just simple riddles. They're these deep philosophical puzzles that really push our understanding of reality right to the absolute edge. Today, we're jumping into one of the all-time greats, the Omnipotence Paradox. So let's get into it and see if we can untangle one of philosophy's greatest knots.
And here it is, the question that's at the heart of this whole thing. Can an all-powerful being create a stone so heavy that even they can't lift it? I mean, it sounds simple enough, right? But no matter which way you try to answer it, you're going to find that you've just walked straight into a perfect logical trap.
And this is that trap in action. Philosophers call it a logical pincer because it closes in on you from both sides. Think about it. There are only two possible answers. Path 1, let's say the being can create the stone. Well, then there's something it can't do. It can't lift the stone. So it's not all-powerful. Okay, what about path 2? What if it cannot create the stone? Well, then there's something it can't do. It can't create it. So again, it's not all-powerful. Either way, the concept of being all-powerful just seems to defeat itself.
So how do we get out of this mess? Well, what if the problem isn't with the concept of power, but with how we're defining it? I mean, to really dismantle a paradox, you've got to start by looking really closely at the words themselves. So our first step has to be asking, what do we actually mean when we say all-powerful?
Historically, you've got two major schools of thought on this. In one corner, you have thinkers like René Descartes. He believed in what you could call absolute power. For him, an all-powerful being is the author of logic itself. So, could it make 2 + 2 = 5? Sure, it's not bound by the rules of logic because it writes the rules of logic. But in the other corner, you have St. Thomas Aquinas. He argued for logical power, the ability to do anything that is logically possible.
And here's the crucial insight from Aquinas. He says a logical contradiction isn't a thing, it's a nothing. So asking an all-powerful being to create a square circle isn't actually asking it to perform a task, it's just you speaking gibberish. The failure here isn't in the being's power, it's a failure in our own language. And that idea right there is one of the main keys to unlocking this whole paradox.
Let's run with that idea for a second, that the problem isn't with the power, it's with our words. What if this entire mind-bending paradox is really just a linguistic illusion? A clever trick that our own language is playing on us? This is where modern philosophers like George Mavros gave us a really useful tool, the concept of a pseudo-task. It's a request that's framed to sound like a real task, but when you look closer, it's just a self-contradictory and totally meaningless jumble of words. The point is, not being able to do a pseudo-task isn't a limitation of power, it's just a reasonable rejection of nonsense.
So let's rephrase the paradox and really expose the contradiction. An omnipotent being is, by definition, a being who can lift any stone. So the task is really asking this: create a stone that the being who can lift any stone cannot lift. Do you see it now? The sentence literally cancels itself out. It's a verbal knot, a contradiction baked right into the question. This leads us right to the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. He basically argued that we get ourselves into these logical messes all the time because we try to use language from one context in another where it just doesn't belong. We're using everyday physical words like stone and lift to try and talk about a concept like infinity. Our language just isn't built for that kind of job.
Wittgenstein had this brilliant metaphor for it. He said philosophical problems like this one are like a fly trapped in a fly bottle. The fly is buzzing around frantically, bumping into the glass walls over and over, completely unable to see the way out, even though the exit is wide open. The paradox is a trap, but it's a trap we built with our own words. And the solution isn't to struggle harder, but to simply see the trap for what it is.
Okay, so the linguistic solution is one way out of the bottle, but it's not the only one. There's another, maybe even more radical escape route. And this one has us rethinking the very nature of power itself. It brings us to the idea of self-limitation.
I mean, really think about this for a second. Is a being that is forced to be all-powerful with no choice in the matter truly free? Or is it kind of trapped by its own nature? Maybe, just maybe, true omnipotence has to include the power of choice, the power to make a promise, or even the power to create a limit for yourself.
And this brings us to something called the temporal solution. Picture it in 2 moments in time. At time 1, the being is fully omnipotent. It uses that very omnipotence to create the unliftable stone. But then, at time 2, as a direct consequence of its own free choice, it is now limited.
It's no longer omnipotent in the same way. In this view, omnipotence isn't a static, unchanging state. It's a dynamic property that actually includes the power to give up that power. The answer to can it create the stone becomes yes, but that yes comes at a price.
So after all these different solutions and philosophical twists and turns, what's the big takeaway? What does this ancient puzzle actually teach us? Well, it turns out the paradox might be less about some hypothetical all-powerful being and a whole lot more about us.
Ultimately, the debate leads you to two major conclusions. On the one hand, for thinkers like J.L. Mackie, the paradox is proof that the whole idea of omnipotence is just logically incoherent. It's a contradiction, so such a being can't exist. But on the other hand, for many theologians, the response is that our finite, human logic is simply the wrong tool for the job. You can't, as they say, measure the ocean with a teacup.
And this, for me, is the real heart of it. Maybe the paradox of the unliftable stone isn't about the limits of power at all. Maybe, instead, it's a powerful mirror. It shows us the exact breaking point, the place where our language and our logic start to crack when they try to grasp a concept as massive as infinity.
So let me leave you with one final profound thought that kind of flips the whole thing on its head. What if we're just asking the wrong kind of question? Perhaps an omnipotent being doesn't interact with the universe like a weightlifter with a barbell. What if that being is the reason that concepts like mass and strength even exist in the first place? It doesn't play by the rules of reality, it is the rules. And that, well, that might be the most powerful idea of all.